It was the cold, mist-laden morning of August 1945, deep within a remote prisoner of war camp in the Philippines. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, drifting from the scattered barracks that had been hastily constructed months before. A faint, pale sun barely pierced the fog, casting long, wavering shadows across the frozen ground. The camp was eerily silent, save for the occasional bark of a guard dog or the shuffle of worn boots on gravel. Inside the barracks, dozens of Japanese women prisoners stirred quietly. Their faces were pale and gaunt, etched with exhaustion and months of uncertainty. Blankets, tattered and damp, clung to their frail bodies as they whispered softly to one another, clutching the remnants of a life far away from this desolate place. The tension was almost tangible, a tightrope of fear stretching across every heartbeat. And then came the abrupt, commanding voice, "Raise your hands." It echoed across the camp like a crack of thunder, freezing the women mid-breath. Eyes widened, hands trembled, and an invisible wall of dread pressed down on each one. None of them could have imagined the events that were about to unfold. History itself poised to carve a memory into their lives, one that would linger far longer than the morning mist. The morning air was bitter, sharp against the skin, carrying a damp chill that seeped through every layer of clothing the prisoners wore. Even the smallest movement caused a shiver to run along their spines, making their muscles tense and their hands tremble slightly, despite the instinctive effort to hold them steady. The frost had not yet melted, and the ground beneath their feet was uneven, a mix of frozen earth and patches of thin mud that clung stubbornly to their worn boots. Each step pressed the cold further into their souls, reminding them of the harshness of the camp and the relentless grip of the unfamiliar environment. The women's hands, raised in obedience to the guard's command, felt alien in their own sight, stiff, unsteady, and vulnerable, symbols of a helplessness that extended far beyond the physical posture. Some gripped the sleeves of their tattered coats, as if that simple contact could anchor them to the remnants of safety, while others let their hands float above their heads, the weight of uncertainty pressing on their shoulders like invisible stones. Their eyes darted constantly, scanning the rigid formation of the camp, taking in every detail of the world around them. The dark, wooden barracks that loomed with oppressive authority, the high fences that encircled the space with silent menace, and the occasional patrol of guards moving like shadows along the periphery. The guards themselves seemed carved from the landscape of fear, tall, broad-shouldered figures whose expressions were unreadable, yet terrifying in their unwavering discipline. Their boots struck the frozen ground with mechanical precision, each step a beat in the slow, horrifying rhythm of the morning. The women watched, each motion magnified in their minds, every minor gesture interpreted as a test of obedience or an omen of punishment. The cold was not the only thing pressing down upon them. The faint scent of smoke from distant fires mingled with the metallic tang of damp earth, creating a smell that clung to the lungs and made every breath feel heavy. Alongside that, there was the ever-present smell of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and worn leather, reminders of weeks and months spent in conditions that had stripped them of normalcy. Each inhale seemed to carry a story of hardship, a whisper of the countless small discomforts that had accumulated into a profound, almost physical despair. Some of the women tried to focus elsewhere, closing their eyes for a brief second, imagining another place, another life, only to have the sudden bark of a dog or the sharp command of a guard jolt them back to the camp with a force that left their hearts pounding. The women's thoughts were a tangle of fear, confusion, and fragmented memories. Some remembered the families they had left behind in cities now ravaged by war, wondering if those they loved had survived or if they would ever see them again. Others replayed the moments of their capture in endless loops, the surrender, the march into unfamiliar territory, the uncertain arrival at this remote camp. Each recollection was accompanied by a physical ache, knees stiff from long hours standing or sitting on cold floors, stomachs clenched from hunger or stress, backs sore from carrying whatever meager belongings had survived the chaos of retreat and capture. Their minds, already strained, now fought to maintain composure under the immediate tension of the raised hand's command. Some whispered silent prayers, murmured inaudibly under the breath, seeking divine intervention, or at least some sense of mercy that the cold, calculating eyes of the guards seemed unlikely to provide. Time itself seemed to stretch and contract unpredictably in the chill of the morning. A single minute could feel like an eternity, each heartbeat amplified against the silence of the camp. The women were acutely aware of one another, their presence a fragile lifeline in the sea of fear. Some glanced sideways at their neighbors, searching for reassurance, but found only reflections of their own trepidation mirrored back. Others lowered their gaze to the mud-caked ground, focusing on the irregular patterns in the frost, trying to count cracks and stones to distract from the weight of what was to come. Every sound was magnified: the crunch of boots on frost, the distant rustle of trees, the faint murmur of conversation in broken whispers, and the occasional snapping of a twig as a dog padded nearby. Even these small, ordinary noises carried a gravity, as if they were part of a larger, unknowable script of fate being written moment by moment. Some women felt a creeping numbness in their fingers and toes, yet the fear coursing through them prevented true detachment. Adrenaline and terror coursed through every nerve, sharpening awareness to an almost unbearable degree. They noticed how the guards' shadows stretched unnaturally long in the dim, gray light, how their rifles gleamed with cold efficiency, and how even the simplest gestures, a tilt of the head, a tightening of a jaw, seemed imbued with the power to decide life or death. Each woman, in her private, silent struggle, calculated her movements with painstaking care. A twitch of a hand, a misstep, a glance in the wrong direction, all could bring immediate consequence. Yet they also fought against complete paralysis, needing to remain upright, to obey, to survive. The textures of the camp were vivid to them, etched into memory by both need and fear. Rough wooden planks scraped the palms of those who held them for balance. Mud seeped through thin socks and the soles of worn boots, and the bitter wind clawed at exposed skin. Their coats, heavy and ragged, bore the stains of months of wear: mud, rain, sweat, and the lingering scent of wood smoke. The blankets they clutched, though thin and threadbare, were a precious barrier against the cold, an intimate shield in an environment that offered no comfort. Some had tried to mend small tears or patches, a futile act of control in a world that had stripped them of so much. Yet the act itself provided a measure of solace, a way to assert presence and agency when so much else was beyond reach. Within this tense environment, the women's internal emotional landscapes were as complex as the external ones. Fear was omnipresent, thick like fog, but it mingled with fleeting sparks of hope, memory, and defiance. Some focused on small acts of kindness between prisoners, a hand offered to steady another, a whispered word of encouragement, a shared blanket, all small rebellions against the overwhelming sense of powerlessness. Others found themselves sinking deeper into anxiety, imagining the worst outcomes of any movement, sound, or command. Every heartbeat seemed to echo in the skull, every breath drawn was measured against the silence, and every glance toward the guards carried the weight of unspoken questions. Why us? What next? How will this end? The prisoners also registered the physicality of their fellow captives, each subtle shift and expression contributing to a collective sense of dread. Faces were pale, eyes wide and haunted, lips pressed together in tight lines of restraint. Hands raised in unison looked like fragile, skeletal extensions of their fear, each trembling movement mirrored across the line. The women's bodies were gaunt, clothing hung loosely on thin frames, hair tangled and unkempt, and yet each one carried the distinct traces of individual personality, background, and story, eroded now but not entirely erased by the experience of captivity. In a strange way, their shared suffering formed a tenuous bond, a silent acknowledgement that they were all bound to the same uncertain fate. The moment seemed to crystallize in the air, the frozen pause between the guard's command and whatever action would follow. The women's senses were heightened to near impossibility. They noted the glint of frost on the wooden fence posts, the way the morning light fell unevenly through the fog, and the subtle creak of timbers in the barracks. Small details, the shifting of mud underfoot, the cold metal of a latch, the smell of smoke mingling with wet earth, became immense markers of reality, anchoring the prisoners to the present even as fear threatened to unravel them. Their minds oscillated between hyper-awareness and numb disbelief, each woman balancing precariously on the edge of terror and survival instinct. It was in these fragile, suspended moments that the essence of the camp, the war, and the prisoner's condition revealed itself most fully. They were entirely exposed, both physically and psychologically, to the will of those who held power over them. Each second of standing there, hands raised, became a study in endurance. The cold, the hunger, the fear, and the relentless uncertainty fused into a singular, almost tangible pressure, pressing against the chest and constricting the throat. Breaths were shallow, movements small, and yet each prisoner knew that any falter could have consequences. And so, in the dim light of dawn, with frost on the ground and fog curling through the air, the women held their hands high, bodies trembling, hearts racing, caught in a single, living moment of anticipation and dread. The fragile line of prisoners seemed to merge with the gray of the morning, ghostly in appearance, yet intensely alive in emotion. Eyes darted, lips trembled with whispered words, and muscles tightened with the effort of maintaining posture under command. The tension created a strange kind of unity, a silent communion of fear, resolve, and survival instinct. There was no dialogue to describe it, the shared terror spoke for itself, and in every quiver of a hand or flutter of an eyelash, the history of this moment was being written indelibly on their bodies, their faces, and their souls. Even the natural world appeared to conspire with the prisoners' emotions. The fog, curling and twisting around their forms, seemed almost sentient, weaving between their bodies and amplifying the feeling of being trapped, watched, and powerless. The skeletal trees swayed gently, their branches creaking as though echoing the prisoners' inner tremors. Birds, sparse and hesitant, waited on distant limbs, their presence a faint reminder of life continuing beyond the camp, yet also a subtle, poignant contrast to the fear-soaked stillness below. Every detail of the environment reflected the emotional landscape, harsh, unforgiving, and saturated with the quiet but undeniable power of fear. The stillness that had briefly enveloped the camp began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, like the subtle tremor of the earth before a storm. A sharp word or a sudden motion could now feel catastrophic, and the prisoners were hyper-aware of every tiny movement around them. Commands from the guards became louder, more insistent, slicing through the morning fog with the harsh clarity of authority. The voices were not raised carelessly, each syllable was deliberate, imbued with a sense of urgency and control that left no room for hesitation or misunderstanding. The women's hearts began to beat faster, the sound echoing in their ears with unnatural clarity. The rise and fall of each syllable seemed to dictate the rhythm of the morning itself, a sinister metronome marking the passage of time in a space where time had already become elastic, stretched thin by fear and anticipation. The women's eyes shifted nervously between one another, some seeking reassurance, others scanning the ground for a distraction, a fragment of focus that might pull them temporarily away from the suffocating anxiety. Mud squelched beneath their boots as they adjusted their footing, trying to find stability in a ground that offered none. The cold had deepened since the dawn, creeping up from the earth and biting into the soles of their feet, numbing toes and ankles even through thick socks. Breath came in small, visible puffs, each exhale a fragile declaration of life in the midst of oppressive control. Tiny tremors ran through their bodies, the result of both cold and fear, yet they struggled to maintain outward composure, hands still raised, backs rigid, eyes fixed on some indeterminate point ahead. A ripple of movement ran through the line when one woman faltered. Perhaps her foot slipped on the frost-hardened mud, or perhaps her resolve wavered under the gaze of a passing guard. The effect was immediate. The guard's sharp, commanding presence descended upon her like a physical weight, and she was forced back into line with a strict word or an upraised arm. The other prisoners watched, frozen in anticipation, every one of them painfully aware of the consequences of any perceived mistake. The world seemed to shrink around them, leaving only the line of women, the looming figures of the guards, and the harsh cold that pressed from every direction. Each movement was magnified in their minds, a potential omen, a test of compliance and survival. The environment itself seemed to mirror the escalating tension. Fog curled thicker now, drifting low to the ground and weaving between the prisoners' legs, as though it had a mind of its own, an omnipresent observer to their suffering. The skeletal trees bordering the camp shivered in the morning breeze, their bare branches scratching at the sky, like the fingers of some unseen entity. The distant hills that had once seemed a reassuring boundary of the camp now felt menacing, a constant reminder of isolation and confinement. Even the small birds that had been cautiously perched on distant branches now moved in abrupt flutters, as if disturbed by the intensity of the prisoners' emotions, the shifting air, and the unseen force of impending consequence. Every sound, the distant bark of a dog, the snap of frost under boots, the low creak of timbers in the barracks, seemed amplified, echoing like a drumbeat against the women's heightened awareness. Some of the prisoners whispered to one another under their breath, small murmurs of encouragement or desperate inquiries into what might happen next. The words were barely audible, swallowed by the thick fog and the oppressive silence that had returned between the guards' commands. Yet even these faint utterances carried immense significance. The tiny threads of human connection stretching across fear, soaked space to remind each woman that she was not entirely alone. Each whisper was an act of defiance in its own quiet way, a fragile assertion of identity and existence amid a situation designed to strip them of both. The guards, however, were acutely aware of these subtle interactions, moving with precise efficiency to suppress any sign of deviation or hesitation, their presence a constant, unyielding reminder of control. The smell of the morning intensified as well, a mixture of frost, damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint metallic tang that clung to human bodies in prolonged confinement. It was the smell of a space governed by necessity and survival, yet it was now punctuated by the sharp tang of fear. A primal, almost tangible scent that seemed to cling to the prisoners themselves. Some inhaled deeply in an unconscious attempt to steady themselves, only to find the air harsh and unrelenting. Others tried to focus on the familiar smells of their own clothing, or the small patches of earth beneath their feet, clinging to sensory anchors in a world that seemed increasingly incomprehensible. The rising tension was mirrored in the prisoners' internal landscapes. Anxiety, dread, and uncertainty combined in a complex web of emotion that made the passage of time torturous. Every heartbeat was amplified, every shallow breath a reminder of vulnerability. Some tried to impose order on their own thoughts, counting silently, tracing imagined patterns in the frost, or rehearsing hypothetical responses to the unknown. Others surrendered to the wave of fear, letting it wash over them in small, tremulous movements, a shiver, a twitch, a flicker of the eye. And yet, beneath it all, there remained a glimmer of determination, an instinctual drive to endure, to survive, even in the face of a command whose implications were as terrifying as they were unknown. Each guard movement was meticulously observed, dissected in the prisoners' minds for hidden meaning. The tilt of a head, the flex of a hand, the angle at which a rifle was held, all became symbols, potential indicators of intent and consequence. The women's heightened awareness of such detail was both a blessing and a curse, sharpening their instincts while feeding the constant churn of anxiety. They became acutely attuned to the subtle rhythms of the camp, the interplay of shadows and light, the subtlest shifts in posture, and the minute variations in sound. In this way, every aspect of the environment, human or natural, was woven into a single, terrifying tapestry of heightened perception. Some of the women tried to steady themselves physically, pressing their palms together in brief, silent gestures of control, or straightening spines that ached from long hours of confinement. They flexed fingers, rubbed hands against the cold fabric of their coats, and pressed foreheads against their raised arms, each movement a small attempt to reclaim a sense of agency. These acts were private and unspoken, yet intensely personal, gestures of resilience in a moment where visibility and exposure carried potential danger. Every micro-movement, however, was under the watchful eyes of the guards, and the knowledge of surveillance added layers of tension to an already charged atmosphere. The women's interactions with each other, though minimal, were significant. A quick glance, a subtle nod, a shared shiver, all communicated volumes in the absence of verbal conversation. These gestures formed a network of silent communication, a quiet but powerful acknowledgement of shared experience and mutual dependence. In some cases, the presence of another human being nearby was a comfort, a reminder that while the environment sought to isolate and control, it could not entirely erase human connection. In other cases, the proximity of another prisoner served as a mirror, reflecting their own terror and amplifying it. Every interaction, every glance, became a carefully calibrated risk in a space where perception could be as critical as obedience. The prisoners also experienced an acute awareness of their own bodies, each sensation intensified by the combination of cold, fear, and hyper-alertness. Muscles ached under prolonged tension. Skin was chilled to the point of numbness, and the delicate shivers that ran through limbs were constant reminders of vulnerability. Even the act of breathing was conscious, deliberate, each inhalation and exhalation a fragile exercise in maintaining composure. The awareness extended to hair, clothes, and skin, each sensation magnified in the consciousness of the prisoners as they balanced the instinct to remain still with the need to survive. The visual tableau of the camp mirrored the emotional intensity of the prisoners' inner experience. The barracks, dark and looming, seemed almost alive, their weathered timbers creaking in the breeze as though whispering secrets to the morning fog. The fences encircling the camp, stark and unyielding, caught the pale light, their rigid vertical lines emphasizing the sense of entrapment. Even the mud underfoot, partially frozen and partially squelched by countless footsteps, seemed imbued with the weight of the prisoners' collective fear and uncertainty. Each element of the camp was a participant in the drama, reflecting and amplifying the human emotion present in every figure standing with hands raised in tense anticipation. By now, the subtle shifts of the morning had accelerated into something more tangible, a rhythm of heightened expectation that gripped every prisoner. The fog thickened further, curling like tendrils around the women's bodies, obscuring the periphery of their vision, and leaving only the line of prisoners, the moving guards, and the immediate ground beneath their feet. Each small movement or sound was magnified in significance, creating a constant, almost unbearable tension. It was a moment suspended between command and consequence, where the mundane act of standing upright became a test of both physical and psychological endurance. As the morning progressed, a faint, distant rumble could be heard, the echo of artillery or other lingering sounds of war that reached the camp like distant thunder. Though faint, it acted as a reminder of the larger conflict that had brought them here, connecting the microcosm of the camp to the vast, chaotic world beyond. For the prisoners, it reinforced both the isolation and the inescapable reality of war. They were small, fragile human figures caught within forces far beyond their control, yet bound to endure, respond, and survive in whatever measure they could muster. The weight of anticipation pressed harder with each passing moment. The women's hands, still raised, were no longer simply a gesture of obedience. They were symbols of endurance, vulnerability, and the fragile hope that compliance might offer protection. Their faces, pale and etched with the fatigue of prolonged confinement, were animated now with the subtle, involuntary expressions of feared eyes wide, brows knit, lips pressed together. Even in their silence, the prisoners' humanity spoke loudly, a testament to resilience under conditions designed to strip it away. Every detail, every movement, and every emotion combined into a tapestry of tension, fear, and fragile hope. The prisoners' minds, bodies, and senses were fully engaged in a continuous effort to survive, to navigate the unknown, and to withstand the weight of commands that could change the trajectory of their lives in an instant. It was a scene of profound psychological intensity, where the boundaries between anticipation and terror blurred, and every sensory input carried amplified significance. The moment of revelation came with a sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the camp's rhythm, a subtle tightening of the air that seemed to compress around the prisoners' bodies. For a heartbeat, the world hung suspended between anticipation and dread, as though time itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold. Then the order was delivered, sharp, final, and inescapable, breaking the fragile illusion of control that had allowed the women to breathe, even shallowly, just moments before. The sound of it reverberated across the frost-covered ground like a low drum beat, and every prisoner flinched in unison, their bodies responding instinctively to a command that carried implications too vast to process fully in the instant it arrived. The cold morning air, once biting, now seemed to press upon their skin with the weight of inevitability, making each shiver, each tremor, a manifestation of fear that was both physical and psychological. Some women gasped, a brief, involuntary intake of air that was immediately stifled by the oppressive tension. Others pressed their hands to their faces, trying to shield themselves from the enormity of what had been demanded, as though the simple act of covering their eyes could render reality malleable or soften the consequences of obedience. Eyes widened, pupils dilated, and every glance became loaded with interpretation. Who would be affected first, who might falter, and who would endure? The line of prisoners seemed to move as one organism, a collective body bound by fear, instinct, and the necessity of compliance. Each subtle twitch, each hesitant shift of footing, was magnified in significance, carrying the weight of potential judgment from the guards who observed with unwavering attention. The guards themselves were a study in cold efficiency, moving with the precision of machines honed by months of practice, and the authority vested in them by the machinery of war. Their faces betrayed nothing, a mask of discipline that only heightened the prisoner's anxiety. A tilt of a head, a tightening of a jaw, a measured step forward or backward, each gesture was imbued with the power to determine the next sequence of events. Even their breathing seemed controlled, deliberate, and somehow amplified in the prisoner's perception, echoing across the fog-laden camp like the faint tolling of an invisible bell. The contrast between the rigid, controlled figures of authority and the trembling, uncertain forms of the women heightened the surreal, almost cinematic quality of the moment. The environment, too, participated in the tension. Fog thickened, curling around the prisoners' legs, masking their lower bodies, and creating an impression that they were suspended in a ghostly world, removed from ordinary time and space. Frost glinted along the edges of wooden barracks, catching the faint morning light and reflecting it back in harsh, cold flashes, while mud squelched softly underfoot, marking each hesitant movement as both proof of presence and vulnerability. The skeletal trees bordering the camp seemed to lean inward, their branches creaking and bending with the breeze, as if pressing closer to witness the unfolding drama. Even the distant rumble of artillery, or the echo of past battles, seemed to reach the camp with a delayed resonance, reminding the prisoners that while this moment was intensely immediate, it existed within a larger, relentless context of war and its consequences. As the order unfolded into action, the women's hands remained raised, yet the meaning of that gesture shifted in real time. What had once been a symbol of obedience, a defensive posture against the authority surrounding them, now carried the weight of exposure, vulnerability, and the unpredictable nature of human judgment. Some held their hands so tightly that the muscles ached, veins standing out against pale skin, knuckles whitening as if to prove their steadfastness in the face of uncertainty. Others allowed subtle tremors to ripple through their arms, movements that reflected the internal struggle between instinctual fear and disciplined compliance. The line of prisoners became a living testament to endurance, a fragile but powerful display of human resilience under conditions that sought to erase individuality and humanity. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Each woman experienced the command and its consequences uniquely, filtered through months of confinement, hunger, fear, and the relentless erosion of normalcy. Memories of families left behind, of homes destroyed, of previous moments of capture, all collided in the mind simultaneously, adding layers of complexity to the raw, present fear. Some drew inward, retreating into a silent mental space where fear was acknowledged but contained, a coping mechanism that allowed them to maintain some measure of functional composure. Others became hyper, aware of every detail, their senses stretched to the limit as they cataloged every element of their environment. The sharp angles of rifles, the texture of frost-laden mud, the shifting shadows of guards moving along the periphery, the low, persistent sound of their own heartbeat, creating an almost unbearable immersion in the immediate moment. Physical sensations were amplified too. Cold that had previously been a persistent discomfort now felt invasive, as though it were pressing into the prisoner's bones and joints. The uneven, frozen ground made every step precarious, every movement deliberate and yet inevitable. Muscles tensed instinctively, shivers ran along spines and fingertips, numb from cold and exertion, tingled painfully, reminding each woman of the fragile nature of her own corporeal presence. Clothing, tattered and worn from months of captivity, offered inadequate insulation, the thin layers unable to protect fully from the dual assaults of weather and fear. Every breath drawn carried the weight of the environment and the tension, sharp and shallow, mingling with the fog, and the faint smoke of distant fires to create a sensory cocktail that pressed upon the prisoners' lungs, hearts, and minds simultaneously. The dynamic between prisoners and guards intensified as the order progressed. The guards' measured movements, their silent inspection of posture, their disciplined commands, were designed to reinforce compliance and suppress hesitation. Even the smallest deviation, a hand lowering momentarily, a head tilting, could be interpreted as resistance or weakness. The women were acutely aware of this, and the mental effort required to maintain perfect alignment, rigid hands, and still eyes was immense. Fear and anticipation became a shared rhythm between the captives and their overseers, a silent negotiation of power and survival that could tilt in an instant based on the slightest human misstep. Meanwhile, the women's interactions with one another, though subtle, carried immense significance. A brief glance, a tremor of a hand, a faint squeeze of another's arm, all became silent communications, gestures of solidarity or reassurance that required careful calibration to avoid detection. These moments were fleeting, yet they infused the prisoners with a measure of psychological sustenance, the knowledge that they were not entirely alone, even in the face of overwhelming authority. Every gesture, every exchange of glances was an act of quiet resistance, a reminder that humanity could persist even under extreme duress. The passage of time seemed to fracture in these critical moments. Seconds felt like minutes, and minutes stretched into an almost surreal duration. The prisoners' internal clocks, already strained by fear and hunger, became unreliable, with each heartbeat counting both as a measure of survival and a reminder of vulnerability. Eyes were fixed forward, muscles tensed, and yet thoughts raced uncontrollably, anticipating the next command, the potential consequences, the unseen mechanisms of power at work. Some women engaged in internal dialogue, rehearsing what they might do in various hypothetical scenarios, while others surrendered to the immediate flood of fear, allowing it to wash over them in uncontrollable shivers. The fog-laden environment contributed to this sense of suspended reality. Mist curled around legs, clung to coats, and obscured the perimeter of the camp, creating an impression that the prisoners were isolated not just physically but temporally, suspended in a liminal space between obedience and consequence. Shadows deepened under the skeletal trees, glinting faintly across frost-covered ground, while the wooden barracks loomed in the background like silent witnesses to the unfolding human drama. Every detail, the gleam of rifles, the rigid posture of guards, the uneven mud, was imbued with symbolic weight, each element a reminder of the precarious balance between survival and catastrophe. For some women, the experience became almost sensory overload. Every sound, sight, and tactile sensation was magnified, as if the heightened state of fear had expanded perception to an extreme. The crunch of frost underfoot, the low murmur of distant commands, the shifting fog, the subtle glint of sunlight on frozen surfaces, all contributed to an intense, almost unbearable awareness of the environment and the stakes it represented. Bodies responded instinctively, muscles tensed, eyes darted, breaths quickened, yet a rigid discipline enforced stillness, a performance of survival written in the language of posture and obedience. And then, in the wake of action, the camp fell into a profound, almost tangible silence. The consequences of the command had been enacted, whatever they may have been, leaving a space thick with residual tension, an aftershock that lingered in the frozen air. The prisoners' bodies relaxed slightly, though the release was tentative, measured, as if any sudden movement might draw attention or reignite the cycle of command. Faces were pale and hollow, marked by exhaustion, fear and relief in varying combinations, each expression telling a story of survival, resilience, and the immediate toll of obedience. The fog, curling and thick, seemed to settle more heavily around the bodies of the prisoners, encapsulating the aftermath in a gray, misty shroud, as though nature itself bore witness to the endurance of these women under circumstances designed to break them. In those final moments, the historical weight of the event became apparent. The women were no longer merely captives, they were participants in a moment of human endurance that transcended individual experience. Each trembling hand, each wide-eyed glance, each tentative shift in posture was a testament to survival, to the fragile persistence of humanity in the face of systemic control and overwhelming fear. The camp, once a backdrop to routine captivity, had become a theater of psychological tension, its every element. The mud, the frost, the fog, the barracks, the trees, and the rigid figures of authority, integrated into a singular, defining moment. Though the immediate crisis had passed, the memory of the event would linger indelibly. Every woman would carry within her the imprint of the morning, a fusion of fear, obedience, exposure, and resilience. The experience would shape memory, perception, and understanding of both self and world for years to come. And as the fog slowly began to lift, and the first hints of sunlight pierced through the gray veil, there remained the unmistakable impression that history had been made in small, intimate, and profoundly human increments, captured in the trembling hands, widened eyes, and taut muscles of those who endured it.